This happened a few years ago, but it still gives me an unsettling feeling whenever I think about it. The only reason I'm talking about it now is because I feel like it's been long enough since it happened, and I won't risk anything by putting it on the internet. Back then, my wife and I had just moved into the suburbs from the city. We just had our third kid, and between the baby stuff, the toys, and the general chaos, our apartment felt way too cramped. We found a nice house in a quiet, safe neighborhood. The neighbors described it as the kind of place where you'd feel fine leaving the doors unlocked. The house itself wasn't massive, but it was definitely a step up from the tiny space we'd previously been living in. One of the features that caught my wife's eye was the backyard. It had this beautiful, slightly overgrown garden with a few old statues scattered around. They were weathered, a little eerie looking, like something out of Game of Thrones. I know it sounds weird, but my wife and I loved it. She said it gave our yard character. I was pretty indifferent, so I left everything as it was, statues and all. I figured it was less work for me, which I was never going to complain about. A few days after we moved in, I was looking out the window, taking in the yard, when I noticed something odd. One of the statues, an angel, I think, was facing away from the house. All the others were facing toward us, so it looked strange. I could have sworn they all faced the same direction, but I didn't really know for sure. I didn't think much of it, and just assumed I was misremembering things. The next morning I looked out the window again, and that's when I noticed it. Another statue had turned around, again facing away from the house. This time, I knew something was up. I had never been more sure about anything in my life. I asked my wife about it, but she just shrugged it off and said she hadn't noticed anything. I thought maybe it was my son, Jimmy. He was a little prankster back then, always up to something, but when I asked him, he just looked at me like I was nuts. I doubted he'd do something like that anyway. I knew something was going on, though, but I couldn't prove it. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I tried to ignore it. Besides, I had bigger problems to worry about. I don't like admitting it, but money was really tight during that time, and I lived in perpetual fear that I was going to lose my job. I prayed for peace, and in the spring of 1944, I lived in perpetual fear that I was going to lose my job. A few days went by without anything strange, and I started to relax. But then one evening I looked out the window and my heart nearly stopped. All of the statues were lined up in a row at the very edge of the house, just standing there. It was a freakish sight, like something out of a horror movie. I know it sounds ridiculous, but part of me could feel all those eyes looking at me. My breathing went shallow. I couldn't decide whether it was more scary or bizarre. I went outside to get a closer look, trying to make sense of it. Before opening up the back door, I took a few nervous glances around the yard to make sure there was no one out there. It was daylight, but I was paranoid. Eventually, I worked up the courage to open the door and go inspect the statues. I went to lift one of them and immediately realized something. Those statues were heavy, way too heavy for one person to move alone. I couldn't even budge one of them on my own. As I was debating what to do, my wife came outside, and the look on her face told me she was just as freaked out as I was. She suggested maybe some of the other neighbors were messing with us, trying to scare the new people on the block. But that explanation literally made no sense. We had met all the neighbors, and they all seemed like fairly normal people. Plus, I had trouble believing that anyone sane would do this to a family with young children. This was harassment, not some harmless prank. We ended up calling the police, but as you might expect, they couldn't do much. They suggested putting up some security cameras, but we didn't have the money for them. I told the cops we would, but on the inside I was really reluctant to do something so drastic. They left, and I guess I felt a little better, even though my wife was still extremely shaken up. My wife and I did everything we could to hide the situation from our kids. Say what you will, but we didn't want to scare them. Nothing happened the next day or the next. I speculated that the cops had scared whoever was there away, which did track on many levels. So we tried to forget about it, even though neither of us really felt comfortable. I tried to assure myself that maybe my wife was right. After he left the building, I tried to assure myself that maybe my wife was right. Maybe it had just been a prank or something. That didn't do anything to calm my nerves, though. I was on edge, looking out the windows every time I passed by, half expecting to see the statues somewhere else. I hope no one ever has to experience the sensation of feeling unsafe in their own home. A few days passed without incident. I started thinking the nightmare was over, and for the first time in a while, the house was actually starting to feel like home. I could not have been more wrong. It was a weekend. I don't remember whether it was Saturday or Sunday, but it was definitely a weekend, since my kids didn't have school. After some breakfast, I went outside to play in the yard with my kids, and that's when I saw it. Spray painted in big black letters on the back wall of our house were the words, "Go away." I nearly dropped my son when I saw it. Without thinking, I brushed my kids inside and told my wife to stay in the house with them. I don't know what came over me. I'm not that brave of a guy. But I started sprinting through the garden, screaming threats at whoever had vandalized my house. Adrenaline was coursing through my veins, and I was looking for a fight. No one was anywhere in my yard, though. Eventually, I gave up looking. As I was walking back toward the house, the adrenaline in me turned to outright fear. This was serious. Someone had left a direct message meant to scare us. They could have meant us harm, and I knew the situation was only going to escalate from there. The police came again and took down another report, but without any leads. There wasn't much they could do. I insisted that they stay on the property in case those people came back, but they told me they didn't have enough evidence to waste resources like that. As far as they knew, some teenage delinquents could have been behind the graffiti. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They told me they'd make sure a patrol officer was nearby, which I guess was some kind of consolation. My wife was twice as upset as I was, so I reassured her that we'd be okay, even though I was freaking out internally. That night, I was in the kitchen when I heard my wife scream from the living room. I ran in, and she was standing by the window, pointing outside. I looked, and my stomach dropped. There were 5 people standing in our backyard, each of them wearing white face coverings. They were dancing around in a strange, jerky way, almost like puppets. We just stood there watching them, too shocked to move. It was terrifying. I don't know what they were trying to accomplish, but it was the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen. I snapped out of my haze and grabbed the phone to call the police. Just as I dialed 911, the figures in the yard stopped dancing and turned to face the house. Their lifeless masks stared directly at us. I felt a chill run down my spine as I pressed the call button and raised the phone to my ear. The operator answered, and I quickly explained the situation, my voice trembling with fear. As I spoke, the masked figures began to slowly advance toward the house. I could hear the operator relaying the information to dispatch, but it felt like time was moving in slow motion. I was frozen in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding outside. Suddenly, one of the figures broke into a sprint, heading straight for the back door. My heart leapt into my throat as I watched, and I barely had time to react. I grabbed my wife and pulled her away from the window, shouting for her to take the kids and hide. She scooped up our youngest and ran upstairs while I rushed to lock all the doors and windows. Just as I finished securing the back door, I heard a loud thud against the front of the house, followed by another. My heart pounded as I realized the masked figures were trying to break in. I grabbed a kitchen knife, the only weapon I could find, and hurried upstairs to join my wife and kids. We huddled together in the master bedroom, the kids crying softly as my wife tried to comfort them. I could hear the sounds of the intruders pounding on the doors and windows, their eerie laughter echoing through the house. My mind raced, desperately trying to think of a way to keep my family safe until the police arrived. The minutes felt like hours, but finally, I heard the distant wail of sirens approaching. The pounding and laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of running footsteps as the intruders fled. I cautiously peeked out the window and saw the flashing lights of police cars pulling up to our driveway. I ran downstairs and flung open the front door, relief washing over me as the officers rushed in. I quickly explained what had happened and they began to search the property, but the masked figures were nowhere to be found. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The police took our statements and assured us they would increase patrols in the neighborhood. They also recommended installing security cameras and an alarm system to help deter any future incidents. Despite their reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over our home. Over the next few days, we took their advice and had a security system installed. My wife and I remained on high alert, constantly checking the cameras and making sure the doors and windows were locked. The kids were still scared, but we did our best to comfort them and make them feel safe. As time passed, the memory of that terrifying night began to fade, but the fear never completely left us. We became more cautious, always aware of our surroundings and the possibility that the masked figures could return. One evening, I was reviewing the security footage when I noticed something strange. In the corner of the yard, barely visible in the shadows, stood one of the statues that had been moved before. It hadn't been there earlier, and I hadn't seen anyone move it. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that we were still being watched. I quickly shared my discovery with my wife, and we decided it was time to move. The safety of our family was more important than any house, no matter how much we loved it. We found a new home in a different neighborhood, far away from the eerie events that had plagued us. As we packed up our belongings, I couldn't help but glance back at the yard one last time. The statues stood there, silent and unmoving, but I knew better than to trust appearances. We never found out who or what was behind the disturbances, but we were grateful to leave that chapter of our lives behind. Our new house was a fresh start, a place where we could finally feel safe again. But the memory of those terrifying nights in our old home would stay with us forever, a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk just beyond the surface. When my husband Mark and I first moved into the newly built house on Maple Street, we were thrilled. It was a dream come true, a picturesque, contemporary home with clean lines and a spacious layout. We had spent months searching for the perfect place to start our new life together, and this house seemed to have it all. Little did we know it also came with something, or someone, we never could have imagined. It all began on our first night in the house. As we unpacked boxes and settled in, I noticed an odd draft in the living room, The air felt unnaturally cold, even though it was the middle of summer. I brushed it off, assuming the new house just needed some time to adjust to us. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity as we painted, arranged furniture, and made the house our own. But it wasn't long before strange things started to happen. At first, it was just little things. Doors creaking open on their own, cold spots in random rooms, and the faint sound of footsteps when no one was there. One evening, as we sat in the living room enjoying a quiet dinner, we heard a soft, melodic humming. It seemed to be coming from the hallway. Mark and I exchanged puzzled glances and got up to investigate. As we approached the hallway, the humming grew louder, echoing through the empty space. But when we reached the source of the sound, it abruptly stopped, leaving us standing in eerie silence. "Must be the pipes," Mark suggested, though his voice was tinged with uncertainty. We tried to ignore the odd occurrences, but they became increasingly difficult to dismiss. One night, I awoke to the sound of whispers. The room was dark, and Mark was sound asleep beside me. The whispers were faint, barely audible, but they seemed to be coming from the corner of the room. My heart raced as I strained to make out the words, but they were just out of reach, like fragments of a forgotten memory. Determined to uncover the source of the disturbances, I began researching the history of the land our house was built on. I discovered that it had once been home to a small settlement in the early 1900s, which had mysteriously vanished. The settlers' disappearance had been blamed on a series of bizarre accidents and sightings of ghostly figures in the area. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to reach out to a local historian, Mrs. Parker, who had written extensively about the settlement. She agreed to meet with me and share what she knew. "I've heard many stories about that land," Mrs. Parker said, as we sipped tea in her cozy sitting room. "But the most persistent one is that a young girl named Lily still lingers there, searching for something or someone." That night, I shared what I'd learned with Mark, and we decided to conduct our own investigation. We set up a few cameras around the house, hoping to capture any paranormal activity. As we reviewed the footage the next day, we saw something that sent chills down our spines. In one of the clips, a translucent figure of a young girl could be seen standing at the top of the staircase, her eyes filled with sorrow. Determined to help Lily find peace, we contacted a paranormal investigator, Dr. Benson, who specialized in spirit communication. She arrived with her equipment and conducted a thorough investigation of the house. As we gathered in the living room, she began to speak to the spirit, her voice calm and soothing. "Lily, if you're here, we want to help you. Please, show us a sign." At first, there was nothing but silence. Then the temperature in the room dropped, and the lights flickered. We heard a soft, familiar humming, the same melody we had heard before. Dr. Benson closed her eyes and continued to speak, her voice gentle and reassuring. "You don't have to be afraid, Lily. We're here to help you find your way." Suddenly, the humming stopped, and a chill ran down my spine. I felt a light touch on my shoulder, like the brush of a small hand. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized that Lily was reaching out to us, seeking our help. Dr. Benson instructed us to hold hands and form a circle. She lit a candle and placed it in the center of the room, its warm glow casting long shadows on the walls. She began to chant softly, calling upon Lily's spirit to join us. For a moment, everything was still. Then the candle flame flickered, and a soft, ethereal light filled the room. In the glow, we could see the faint outline of a young girl, her eyes filled with longing and sadness. "Lily," Dr. Benson whispered, What do you need to find peace? The room grew colder, and the whispering returned, louder this time. We could make out the words, find me, repeated over and over. Dr. Benson's eyes widened as she realized what Lily was trying to tell us. We need to find her remains, she said. Lily's spirit won't rest until she's properly laid to rest. Determined to fulfill Lily's request, we began searching the house and its grounds for any clues to her whereabouts. We combed through old documents, examined every nook and cranny, and even enlisted the help of a local archaeologist. Days turned into weeks, and our search seemed fruitless. But one afternoon, as we were exploring the basement, Mark noticed a loose floorboard. With a sense of foreboding, we pried it up, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside, we found an old tattered doll and a child's locket. The locket contained a tiny portrait of Lily, her eyes filled with the same sorrow we had seen in the apparition. Dr. Benson inspected the items and confirmed that they belonged to Lily. She suggested we conduct a final seance to help guide Lily's spirit to the afterlife. That evening, we gathered in the living room once more, holding hands and forming a circle around the candle. As Dr. Benson chanted, the room grew cold, and the ethereal light returned. Lily's figure appeared before us, her eyes filled with gratitude. The whispering grew louder, and we could hear her voice clearly now. Thank you. Thank you. With a final flicker, the candle flame extinguished, and the room was plunged into darkness. The oppressive chill lifted, replaced by a sense of peace and tranquility. We knew that Lily had finally found her way. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences ceased, and the house felt warm and inviting. We laid the doll and locket to rest in a small garden in the backyard, creating a memorial for Lily. The garden flourished, and the house became a place of joy and happiness. Though we never forgot the harrowing experiences we went through, we were grateful to have helped Lily find peace. Our home on Maple Street became a symbol of hope and redemption, a place where the past and present could coexist in harmony. Don't get the wrong impression. I don't even know if I can really call it a balcony. It was barely big enough to stand on, and I couldn't even fit a chair out there. Regardless, I went out there most nights after work to take a break and clear my head. I smoked pretty often but hated the smell, so smoking inside wasn't an option for me. The balcony was perfect for that exact reason. I didn't even have to go outside or leave the comfort of my own home to smoke. It felt like a luxury. I'll describe the layout of the property, so what I'm about to tell you makes sense. The block I lived on was pretty standard, with houses adjacent to each other all the way down the street. Behind mine was exactly the same, meaning everyone's house would be sharing a backyard if it weren't for the 10-foot-tall fences designating the property lines. From my balcony, I could see over my backyard, neighbor's fence, and into his yard. You could see the whole place, really. After a few weeks, I realized I'd met almost all the neighbors except him. Come to think of it, I don't think I had ever seen him, let alone had a conversation with him. The guy never waved, never came over. I never saw him in the yard or at the bedroom window. Nothing. It was like he didn't exist. If it weren't for the occasional bedroom light on at night, I would have assumed the place was deserted. I guessed that there was an old person living there since the grass looked like it hadn't been cut in years, and I never heard any sounds from their yard. After another week, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to go introduce myself and at least put a face to the name. One Saturday, I walked around the block to his place, expecting to knock on the door and maybe make some small talk. But the house looked rough. Rough was an understatement. It looked completely untouched. The yard was a mess. overgrown with weeds, and the whole place looked like it had been ignored for years. The paint was chipping, some of the siding had been scratched off, and the walkway was stained. The doorbell was broken, so I gave a few loud knocks and waited. Nothing. I felt awkward standing there, and started to wonder if maybe the place really was vacant. But then I saw a slight movement behind the window shade. Just a flicker, like someone was peeking out. That was enough for me. Someone was in there, spying on me, but wouldn't open the door for some reason. I turned to leave when all of a sudden the door flew open, slamming against the wall, like someone had ripped it open in a violent rage. He jumped back, totally thrown off. I whipped around and found myself face to face with an elderly Asian woman standing in the doorway, staring at me. She was short with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her skin was wrinkled but somehow tense, like she was flexing her face muscles, if that even makes sense. Her eyes were wide, unsettlingly wide. I can't even lie, I was pretty freaked out just looking at her. There was something off about her, like it looked like she was on something. She didn't say a word, just stared with no expression on her face. Eventually I cleared my throat and introduced myself as her new neighbor. After a few seconds, she said her name was Priscilla, and gave me a half smile, and that was it. She didn't even ask my name, she just stood there watching me. I nodded and turned away, not knowing what to say. I left feeling more unnerved than I wanted to admit. I never heard the door close behind me, but I didn't want to turn around and get caught looking. Later that night, I went out to my balcony as usual, trying to forget about the strange interaction. At that point, I had no idea of the ordeal that I had just gotten myself into. When I glanced over the railing, there she was, that crazy-looking lady from earlier, standing dead center in her seat, looking straight up at my house. She didn't move, didn't call out, just stood there staring. It was one of those moments where you wonder if you're actually seeing what you think you're seeing. I didn't know if I should say something, wave, or pretend like I hadn't noticed her. It was one of the freakiest things I'd ever seen, and I didn't know how to handle it. I went back inside and told myself she was just a little messed up in the head and that I shouldn't be getting worked up over a harmless old lady. But it didn't stop there. The following night I saw her again, but this time she was moving from one window to another inside her house, watching me from each one. Although I pretended not to notice her, part of me felt like she knew that I knew she was watching. I was hoping she'd stop, but she didn't. She was still looking at me when I finished smoking and turned to go inside. Out of curiosity, I peeked out one of my windows about 20 minutes later to see if she was still looking at my house. To my horror, she actually was. I called my dad, and he told me that she probably had dementia or something, and that she was most likely just lonely or confused. He told me that I should actually feel bad for her. It was kind of hard to feel bad for someone who was borderline stalking me, but my dad calmed my nerves and assured me that she was harmless. A few nights passed without anything weird happening. I didn't see her in her heart or at any of her windows. I thought maybe my dad had been right and was starting to feel glad that I hadn't done something drastic. That is, until one morning when I found a woman's sock on my side of the fence, just sitting in my yard. I stared at it, feeling a chill run through me. This wasn't just her strange behavior anymore, she'd been on my property. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to confront her, but I was starting to feel like I couldn't ignore it either. I should have called the police right there, but I didn't because I didn't want to create issues with a neighbor. That night, as I was laying in bed, the doorbell started ringing not once, not twice, but at least a dozen times, one right after the other. I didn't even need to look, I knew it was her. In my tired haze, I wasn't thinking clearly. I was more annoyed than scared. I got up, threw on a shirt, and went to the door, telling myself I would just ask her to leave me alone. I told myself that I'd been putting this off for long enough, and it was about time I dealt with it. I have no idea why I wasn't scared in that moment. I still look back and cringe at how flippantly I handled the situation. I don't even want to say I was naive, but I can't think of a better word to describe my attitude toward it all. The second I opened the door, she lunged at me. She ran full speed at me with a kitchen knife in her hand, her face twisted in rage. She started screaming, yelling something about how I had taken her son from her. He barely had time to process what was happening. I grabbed her arm, managing to wrestle the knife out of her grip, and I pinned her down on the Pichtasser. She was easy to overpower, but that didn't make the situation any less terrifying. My heart was racing, and my hands were shaking as I held her there and called the police. She was still screaming nonsense about her son and told me that she was going to kill me. At one point, she tried to bite me, but I wasn't going to let her go school. It was the longest 5 minutes of my life. She never stopped screaming or squirming the entire time. When the police finally arrived, they restrained her and forced her into one of their cruisers. She screamed the whole time, and I could still hear her screaming even after they shoved her in the car. I had never been more scared in my life. The police made sure I was okay and told me she'd be sent to some kind of psychiatric facility. I never saw her again after that. This incident still weighs pretty heavily on my mind and has definitely made me a more paranoid and cautious person. I ended up moving out not even a year later.